Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who are on a mission from God. Each week we spin the wheel and land on a different genre. Spies, mysteries, horror, romance, SF, it's all on the shelf. And right now we are reading every short story in Harlan Ellison's 1967 anthology Dangerous Visions, including this one, Jonathan Brand's Encounter With A Hick. I'm Zach, and this week I'm really interested in concept. We've spent a lot of time talking about big concept, small concept. Do these stories have interesting concepts? And I feel like this is a good place to step in and talk about it.
I'm Bob. I'm really interested in, I guess, really asking a question. What is the role of God in science fiction? Does it change through generations? You know, if Harlan Ellison is trying to depart from Golden Age fiction, now creating New Wave fiction, is it a Harlan Ellison thing to be very anti-theist, or is it science fiction? Or does science fiction have a place for God? I'm really curious about this. So if anyone would like to comment, that would be really wonderful. But let's talk about what actually happens in this story, Encounter With A Hick. It is kind of, I guess it's just like a bar story. It's almost like a joke. You know, there's a setup. Two people are in a bar and they meet this guy. He's got a long white beard. He's very strange. He seems to be an expert in different sciences, an expert in theology, an expert in languages. He's just sitting there and these two characters are kind of on a poorer planet, or as this man describes it, a planet. What's the line? It's really great. It's all bluegrass, and they literally mean it's just all blue grass. But they are extremely, extremely, extremely wealthy. The two characters who are kind of on a date, or they are together, and the narrator he says his dad owns 200 galaxies or something like that. He's in subdivisions. But in this future, that means owning galaxies. So he's done pretty well for himself. The narrator himself says, oh, I've got these postdoctorates, I've got these degrees, I'm extremely well learned. And then my girlfriend's even better because her dad he owns everything. And her dad has this weird, what do they call it? This photosynthetic evolution process. Basically, they have this system for creation. Then they talk to this Hick. The Hick kind of has a strange episode where he's described as immolating, but not really. He's just cocktail straws are thrown on him, and that's the end of the story. It's a strange setup.
Yeah.
What am I missing?
So one of the interesting dynamics of this is that he's not speaking to the reader. He's speaking to a police officer. He's telling the police officer what just went down, maybe why this man is, I don't know, dead on the floor, self-immolated. It's not clear what the Hick's fate is, but he's basically running through the police officer to the police officer, like what just went down. And he's kind of explaining his side of the story of why some kind of bar fight thing just happened. So right off the bat, that tells me that maybe this may not be an entirely reliable narrator. And part of my thinking of that was that I had to always decipher what he's saying. He speaks with so much kind of like slang and big talk, and
he's a real hip cat.
Feels like, yeah, he's a hip cat. That I just didn't quite trust him. But the other thing is that the reason for the fight, as best as I could tell, is that what he says is, I identified this Hick as being someone from a planet that my father probably created. Quote, it's a process for creating habitable planets from anything which swings in that right temperature zone where anthropoid types can walk around without any clothes on, which is a key experience. So basically, they make habitable planets. He identifies this person as probably coming from one of the planets that his dad's corporation made. And what he has is a brochure where it's basically like, oh, on the first day we make this. On the second day we make that. On the third day we make this. And, you know, it's all done. You get your full planet in 6 days. And on the final day, they make all the people for for kickstarting off a population so that you can rest on the weekend. And basically what he's doing is he's rewritten the book of Genesis as a kind of sales brochure of like what this corporation can do and has done before.
I want to see more about what you think about this idea of religion, because it is, or Christian religion specifically, because it is 6 days and then a seventh day he rests. And I'm wondering, is that offensive to the hick at the bar? And what is the point of calling this guy a hick? He also calls him, it's like he can't figure out what this old man is. He also calls him the grizzled old musician / priest / surgeon, when he launches into a creation myth. And already you mentioned Genesis, but what he quotes from is the book of Job. He quotes it directly from the King James Bible. He says, "Gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee and declare thou unto me." And then the narrator talks to us again. He says, "You see, I aim to reproduce his colorful dead language right down to its woolen jerkin. I should have taken notes. What a thesis." And then he continues directly from King James. He says, "By whom were all things created that are in heaven, all the stars of light." So he's going from Job, and that's the scene in Job where God comes down and says, "Look, Job, yes, all these bad things have happened to you, but how dare you criticize God and the intention of God? God will make things happen, whether they're good or whether they're bad. Did you create the Leviathan? No. How can you possibly understand?" But here it's interesting because the narrator is kind of poking fun at this old man. And then his dad has created creation. It's almost sacrilegious. But the author says he doesn't believe in God. He believes, Jesus, Thoreau, and Mao Zedong. But he also says, to think that the creator of the universe is necessarily the moral superior of man is as naive as to think that the builder of skyscrapers is greater than the carpenter just because his product is larger. And this reminds me a lot of when we read Evensong by Lester Del Rey, which is the first story in Dangerous Visions, and earlier Shall the Dust Praise Thee by Damon Knight, where we have these things of God kind of was a thing, according to these authors, but now is not important anymore. So it's like God exists, but is not important. And in the same thing, it feels like the hick is God, but is not a very functional God, because now these humans who are extremely rich have outdone God. Do you think it's in relation to, it's not in direct relation to Evensong or Shall the Dust Praise Thee, but do you feel like the attitude is similar here?
Oh, that's interesting, because I had read the hick as a kind of like true believer of an antiquated religion, if that makes sense. But I think it also works just as well to view it as an encounter between, the old God, the old, God of this planet. I think that if you think about the time scales involved, because this was something I was thinking about. I was like, why is, in my first reading of this person being just a literal hick from the planet, I was like, why is this person who can presumably only be around for 60 to 120 years, the average human lifespan, what are they doing in this bar with all these people who are living the lifespan of galaxies? I think if you read the story as a fable, it's not a problem, or like a satire, it's not a problem, or just, a kooky fantasy, it's not a problem. But if you do engage with it in the level of like the fictive God meets the corporate God, the corporation that creates universes and religions, then that actually is a really interesting contrast and confrontation.
I think we can, it is kind of a wacky reading I'm doing here, but I think we can kind of do it because the author really goes to great lengths to get a kind of indifference. So it's not just being indifferent towards a hick, it's also being indifferent towards everything that hick represents. And at the time that he says he has his regrettable collapse, but then he says that he just suddenly immolates, and it's almost like he's doing a show. He's doing his special show. And that here is, who knows exactly what that is. He's really catching fire, but it kind of feels like something miraculous or something terrible, like in an awesome sort of way, where you're like, what is happening? Something numinous. But it's interesting that I don't know, the science fiction attitude in Dangerous Visions, in this new wave of trying to escape God, or trying to, again, it might just be a Harlan Ellison thing, but it's kind of anti Christianity in a way of still dealing with Christianity, which is quite interesting because then it's asking really big questions about humans, God, does God exist? What is the universe? And in a way, maybe that's what science fiction can do, which is kind of thrilling. And I was wondering, when we talked to the Huguenots, Brent and Cody, they had a really great point about that Carl Sagan book, Contact, where they said it's different from the movie. And in the end of Contact, the Jodie Foster character, I can't actually remember the character's name, but the Jodie Foster character has this experience where she goes and sees her father in a different galaxy, but she finds out that the spaceship never left. She hasn't gone anywhere. It's all been in her head. But to her, that experience was true. So she's had a real run-in with someone from the other realm, something that's somewhat godlike. And I thought that was so interesting for Carl Sagan to do, to have science and also a spiritual side, or at least a run-in with something like that. Not necessarily any one religion, but having this spiritual experience through science. And I think that's kind of interesting. And I wonder, does science fiction change? Is it author to author, or is there a trend in different epochs of, well, I can't say epoch, different eras of science fiction where there is trying to get away from God, trying to embrace God, trying to embrace the spiritual? How does that arc look, or is it just random for each author?
When I feel like the stereotype for most SF authors is to be, a totally atheistic and materialistic universe.
Mm-hmm.
But I can think of other genres where they do blend either religion or spirituality of some kind into it. G.K. Chesterton, his mystery stories, for example, that feature a Catholic priest, Father Brown. Oh, is he Catholic? Well, he's a priest, and he's Father Brown, solving crimes based off of his theological understanding of human nature. And Chesterton also has a spy novel, The Man Who Is Thursday, which also folds in these themes, which I believe we are reading very soon.
I'm so excited.
Yeah. I would love to read kind of like religious science fiction, or even just something that, because okay, I feel like maybe by calling it science fiction, you're loading the scales, if that makes sense. You're it can only be about science. But when you talk about it as speculative fiction, in that sense, I mean, the Left Behind series, if you remember those, Walmart bookshelf classics, those could be considered speculative fiction under a religious banner.
For sure.
I don't know. It's a really interesting point of exploration that I feel like we should source some recommendations from the audience and find what we're going to read next.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to go looking for. I mean, you could look religious science fiction books, but then you're just going to get very specific, Left Behind, or things that were designed. But I'm curious about how does science fiction help us shape our ideas about religion, or vice versa? I guess that's not really a vice versa issue. But here's another thing to think about. When George Lucas decided to, in the the prequels to Star Wars, to change the Force into midichlorians, that really angered a lot of people. I think it's still an interesting idea to take something that was spiritual and then see if there is a science fiction element. But it also does feel kind of like, ugh. It was just interesting to have that. Maybe it's just because it's adapting something that was already beloved and then saying, nope, what you thought it was not really that way. Here's the true explanation. But I'm just curious, is there a trend where it goes, okay, spiritualism down to no, completely materialism, or whatever you would call that, then back to spiritualism? Well, I'm curious about these trends in science fiction.
I think we just got to keep reading, and I think that we're going to have to go off some of the main beaten paths, away from the, like the Hugo Award winners. A book that just came to mind, which we just did an episode on, Roger Zelazny's Lord of Light. That is a book that deals with religion, and yet everything is very materially grounded. It deals with the Hindu pantheon.
That's true.
On a far future planet. But, oh wait, they're all just people who have significantly higher technology than everyone else on the planet. So it's using religion as a template, or like religious stories as a template, and even some religious themes as a template, like kind of self-cultivation, uh, hauntings, like demonology, stuff like that. But it's all very, like, it takes pains to give a scientific explanation for everything, which is, I think, ultimately very unsatisfying. I think that when I do think of good religious fiction, um, ultimately, I think it needs to have a ethical or moral component to it. And I think you only really see that in horror. Actually, for some reason, horror seems to be like the flip side of Christian lit, if that makes sense. So like an example being books and media like The Omen, The Exorcist, where the world is kind of painted as a cosmic battle between good or evil, in which humans are merely just caught in the middle. And it's not God, devil, it's like a whole gradation of everything in between, demons and angels and stuff like that. I'll probably get flack for this because this is kind of panned as one of the worst movies ever made, but I loved the like actual Christian made movie Nefarious, because it really crystallizes this view of like individual moral choices as taking place within a framework of good and evil. Obviously, Nefarious, unlike a lot of the other horror movies, Nefarious has the goal of like actually converting people to being Christians. But yeah, so this entire, to wrap it all up, this entire framework is missing from science fiction entirely. Any kind of moral framework is missing.
That's so interesting too. Okay, I want to look at that more as we go in the future. There's so many videos recently about this is what science fiction did in the past and why it was good. And now this is what new science fiction, modern science fiction is missing. I wonder if there is a difference, if morals have ended up in science fiction or not. Because I feel like many of the books now, you look at the hero's journey, you want to deliver what people know, you have that, and often there is a moral component. You've grown in a way, but also you've learned something that kind of lets you, I don't know, work with society a little bit better. And maybe old science fiction books were not as much of a like super ego trip, teaching you how to be a better person or something like that. It might have been exploring ideas more freely. I have no idea, but that would be an interesting thing to see too. What's the difference between slightly older science fiction, especially 70s and 80s, and then now science fiction in the last 5 years? Is there a big difference there too?
I think next time we do a science fiction run, let's look specifically at the most popular books that have been published in the last 5 years, and we can try to see what we can find. But it's hard because I feel so uninterested when people give me the synopsis of like more recently published SF works. I'm just kind of like, yeah, okay,
Ready I was really hoping you were going to say, let's read all of Left Behind.
Oh.
I thought that's where you were going.
Cool. Well, I think we're both pretty much out of things to say on this story. So, yeah. I'll talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.